The next essay which we are going to revise is essay 610 using the work of the internal auditor. Here first X Limited CAA. X Limited is the company of which the audit is being conducted. Okay. X Limited has appointed CAA as a statutory auditor. Okay. And X Limited also has an internal auditor which audit the internal controls. Now CAA can may use the work of internal auditor. Internal audit function without any direct assistant. External auditor will use the work of internal auditor, read his report, discuss the procedure, etc. But internal auditor will not work under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. Here, external auditor is CAA, and internal auditor. Next is internal auditor under direct assistant arrangement. Internal auditor will work under the direction, supervision, and review of the external auditor. There are two approaches. First is using the work of internal auditor function. It means no direct assistant is given. Second approach is using internal auditor to provide direct assistance to external auditor. First is determining whether to use his work or not, evaluating the internal audit. External auditor will evaluate the work of internal auditor. Objectivity, competence, and approach. Organizational status should support the objectivity. Sufficient competence to perform the internal audit. Systematic and disciplined approach while performing the internal audit. If there is a sufficient doubt over the objectivity, competence, and approach, then do not use the work of the internal auditor or use less of his work. Determining in which areas and to what extent external auditor can use the internal auditor's work. Evaluate the scope of work of the internal auditor as agreed with the management to understand whether it is relevant or not for external auditor. Areas in which using the internal auditor's work is allowed. Areas in which external auditor should use less of internal auditor's work or avoid using it and perform more of the work directly. And last is coordinate with the internal auditor. Means discuss the nature, timing, and extent of the procedure. Evaluating the adequacy of the work performed. External auditor shall perform following procedure to determine whether the work of the internal auditor is adequate for the purpose of the audit. Inquiry, observation, entry, perform some of the work done by the internal auditor and reviewing internal auditor's working paper if necessary. Using internal auditor, providing direct assistance to external auditor. Here, where no direct assistance is provided, evaluate objectivity, competence, and approach. And here, evaluate legal prohibition in using internal audit for direct assistance, objectivity, and competence. If there is a legal prohibition or sufficient doubt over the objectivity and competence, then do not use the internal auditor worker to provide the direct assistance to the external auditor. Prior written agreement with the management and internal audit agreeing for the direct assistant arrangement. Areas in which external auditor can use the internal auditor to provide direct assistance, and areas in which external auditor Areas in which external auditor should not use internal auditor to provide direct assistance. And the last is direction, supervision, and review the internal audit in accordance with SA 220. External auditors should reperform some of the work done by the internal auditor. External auditor should be satisfied that internal auditor has obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence in relation to the work allocated to him, and working papers of the internal auditor under the direct assistant arrangement will be the property of the external auditor. Now, where the reference is given, note 2, note 1, note 3, these all are the notes. We'll read it. Note 1. Work of the internal audit function that can be used by the external auditor include the following. First is testing the operating effectiveness of the control, substantive procedure involving limited judgments, observation of the inventory count, tracing the transaction through the information system relevant to the financial reporting, testing of the compliance with the regulatory requirement. In some circumstances, audit or review of the financial information of the subsidiaries that are not significant component to the group, where this does not conflict with the requirement of the SA 600. Note 2. The external auditor shall make all significant judgment in the audit engagement, and to prevent undue use of the work of the internal audit functions shall plan to use less work of the function and perform more of the work directly in case of the following circumstances where more judgment is involved: planning and performing relevant audit procedure and evaluating the audit evidence gathered. The higher the assessed risk of material misstatement at the assertion level, with a specific consideration given to the risk identified as significant, the less the internal audit functions, the organizational status, and relevant policies and procedure adequately support the objectivity of the internal auditor, and the lower the level of the competence of the internal audit function. Note 3 is the external auditor shall not use the internal auditor to provide a direct assistance to perform the procedure, making a significant judgment in the audit, relate to higher assessed risk of material misstatement where the judgment required more than limited, relate to the work which is reported to the management or TCWG by internal audit function, and relate to decisions of the external auditor make in accordance with the essays. Now we are going to revise the next essay, essay 260, communication with those charged with governance. First is, who is those charged with governance? It depends upon the size ownership of the entity. For example, supervisory board, non-executive, that is legally separate from the executive management. Supervisory and executive function of the single board, one tier. And in government entities, TCWG may not be a part of the entity, it could be an external party. Second is matters to be communicated, plan and find a responsible independence. What is plan? Plan scope and timing of the audit, communicate materiality, internal control relevant to the audit, preliminary views about the key audit matter, expert involvement, risk areas of the significant risk, significant finding from the audit, accounting practices, qualitative aspect, discussion of the policy estimate and disclosure, difficulties encountered during the course of the audit, delay, denial, short time, refusal to provide information, etc. Report modification, qualified adverse disclaimer opinion, emphasis of matter paragraph, other matter paragraph, key audit matter, etc. Matters subject to discussion with the management, significant event on transaction in current period, appointment and fees related matters on which there is a disagreement between the auditor and management, written representation that auditor is requesting, and other matters relevant to financial reporting that requires the attention of TCW. The third is manner of communication. Written declaration regarding the compliance with the independence, mandatory in case of listed entities. Content of such communication. First is team and a firm has complied with the independence. All relationship and other matters between the firm, network firms and the entity that in the auditor's professional judgment may reasonably thought to bear on independence. They shall include total fees charged during the period covered by the financial statement for audit and non-audit services and related safeguards that have been applied to eliminate the identified threat to independence or reduce them to an acceptable level. Auditor's responsibilities in relation to audit of the financial statement.